I have always been fond of Japanese culture, with an inexplicable yearning for ancient temples, traditional tea ceremonies, and hot springs. Thus, when my Japanese friend, Mr. Sato, invited me to a hot spring deep in the mountains, I accepted without hesitation. It was an old hot spring establishment nestled among the mountains, said to have a history of over 100 years. The journey was long. We took a train and then a bus, and finally, we walked for a while before reaching our destination. The inn was surrounded by snow, as if we had entered a secluded fairy tale world. The innkeeper greeted us warmly and enthusiastically recommended the open-air hot spring above the inn, saying that the view was stunning, especially when soaking in the moonlight, which was an indescribable pleasure. That night, the moon was bright, and the silvery snow glittered under its light. Mr. Sato and I put on thick coats, brought towels, and headed for the open-air hot spring. The path was covered with snow and difficult to traverse, but the bamboo groves on either side and the distant snow-capped mountains were intoxicating. We chatted and laughed, feeling exceptionally relaxed. After soaking in the hot spring, we felt an unprecedented relaxation surrounded by steam. However, on our way back, the weather suddenly changed, snowflakes began to fall, and fog quickly enveloped the entire forest. The path became even more indistinct, and we could barely recognize the trail. At that moment, I faintly heard a low chant. The sound was like a whisper in the wind, initially very faint, but it became clearer as our footsteps continued. Mr. Sato said that this sound had a name called chanting sutras, a practice where Japanese monks recite scriptures while walking, as a form of spiritual training while traveling through various places. Mr. Sato said with confusion, in the wilderness and during a heavy snowfall, how could there be a monk chanting sutras? I looked ahead, and by the light of the moon, I saw a group of monks dressed in dark robes. They wore conical hats and held rosaries, walking in a line, slowly approaching us. Their steps were light, almost without the sound of stepping on snow, and they chanted scriptures with their heads down. The sound seemed to come from all directions, carrying a sense of oppression that made my heart race. I was stunned, staring at them, feeling an inexplicable chill rising from my back. "Don't look!" Mr. Sato suddenly whispered sharply, grabbing my arm. His face was pale, and his expression was unusually serious as he whispered, "Turn around and squat down." I didn't understand why, but the tension in his voice made me comply. I followed him and squatted by the roadside bushes, with my back to the monks. I heard their footsteps getting closer, but they were still light, as if they were floating. The sound of the scriptures overpowered the howling cold wind. I held my breath, my heart almost jumping out of my chest. The monks slowly passed behind us, and in the cold air, there was no trace of human presence. At that moment, I suddenly felt something was wrong. They didn't seem like living beings but more like a group of shadows. As the sound of the scriptures gradually faded, I thought the danger had passed and couldn't help but sneak a peek. They had already walked 10 paces away, but in that instant, the entire row of monks froze and then slowly turned their heads. Under the moonlight, their faces were obscured by their hats, and their features were unclear, but their hollow eyes stared at me from the shadows. That gaze was cold and lifeless, as if it wanted to suck out my soul. My mind went blank, and I was stiff and unable to move. "Run!" Mr. Sato's voice suddenly brought me back to reality. He grabbed my wrist and dragged me into a sprint. We ran frantically on the snowy ground, with the fog around us getting thicker, and the sound of the scriptures rang out again, this time even more piercing, like a sharp blade cutting through the eardrums. I didn't dare to look back, knowing I had to run, had to escape this eerie forest. But as I ran, I suddenly felt a lightness in my arm. Mr. Sato's hand was no longer there. I stopped and looked around. The thick fog seemed to be devouring my vision, and everything around was a white void, with no visibility. "Mr. Sato!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the fog, but there was no response. The sound of the scriptures got closer and closer, as if right by my ear, like countless whisperers surrounding me. I began to panic and felt around, but all there was around me was the cold air and the deep snow, with no one present. As I was about to call out again, a cold hand suddenly grabbed mine. I was so scared that I almost screamed, but the next second, that hand pulled me forward. "Mr. Sato!" I shouted as I ran, my fear slightly alleviated. "I've finally found you." However, after running for a while, I suddenly saw Mr. Sato's figure through the gaps in the fog. He was standing not far away, seemingly looking for something. I stopped, my heart momentarily stopped beating. Then who was the one pulling me just now? That hand still tightly held mine, but the coldness was more pronounced, as if my bones were frozen. I stiffly looked down. It was a pale, thin hand with unusually long nails, not at all human-like. I violently shook off that hand, fell to the ground, and crawled frantically towards Mr. Sato. Seeing this, Mr. Sato immediately ran over to help me up. His face was pale, and his tone carried suppressed fear. "I got lost just now, and I had no idea where you were." My mind was blank, and I shivered, asking, "Then what was pulling me just now?" At that moment, the fog around us suddenly began to dissipate, and the snowy ground became clear again, but the monks chanting scriptures had vanished, leaving only an empty path. We didn't say another word and hurriedly ran towards the hot spring inn. We hurried back to the hot spring inn, and the innkeeper, seeing the look of terror on our faces, was taken aback for a moment before she asked in a low voice, "Did you encounter something?" We pantingly recounted our experience to her. After listening, her expression turned somewhat grave, and she said she had also heard of this legend. She told us that many years ago, there was a group of monks who were practitioners from a nearby temple. They were usually respected by the villagers and often helped everyone with blessings. One winter, a sudden blizzard struck the mountains, and the snow fell so heavily that almost nothing could be seen. Those monks had just finished a prayer ceremony and were preparing to return to the temple when they were trapped by this blizzard. The snow grew heavier, and they lost their way, unable to find the direction back. The cold wind was piercing, and their strength was dwindling. The monks huddled together, hoping to get through the ordeal with sincere prayers, but the blizzard did not spare them, and the snowstorm grew worse. Time passed, and their bodies could no longer hold on, and they eventually collapsed in the snow, never to rise again. Later, when the blizzard finally ceased, the villagers went up the mountain to search for the monks, but to their bewilderment, they could not find any trace of the monks' bodies, not even a single clue. Since then, the people in the village have claimed that during every heavy snowfall, they could hear the distant chanting of the monks. The sound was low and faint, drifting in with the wind, sending shivers down the spines of those who listened. After the innkeeper finished speaking, the atmosphere in the shop immediately became very oppressive. We recalled our recent experience, and still felt a chill in our hearts, as if the voices hidden in the snowstorm were still echoing in our ears, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. When we left the hot spring inn, the innkeeper stood at the door, bowing slightly to see us off. I couldn't help but look back one more time at the deep mountain inn shrouded in snow mist, and an indescribable sense of unease welled up in my heart.